Right. So good evening, everyone. My name is Evan Stankovic, Adult Programming Librarian at the Northside Library. And on behalf of the Jefferson-Madison Regional Library, we welcome you to the virtual program, The History of Anti-Asian Violence in the U.S. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please do remember to visit jmrl.org for a complete and frequently updated schedule of upcoming virtual programs for all ages. Notably, 2 Juneteenth panelist discussions coming up on June 17th and June 22nd. Visit jmrl.org for details and to register today. As always, a special thanks to the JMRL Friends of the Library for their amazing and generous support. This program is being recorded for inclusion on JMRL's YouTube channel. Barring any technical difficulties, we'll hope to have it posted within the next couple of days. As a courtesy to this afternoon's presenter, mics have been muted. At the end of the program, there will be a designated time for questions and answers. You can type them into the chat box or utilize the raise hand feature, and I can unmute your mic so you can ask your question out loud. Again, we ask that all questions please be saved for the Q&A session after this evening's presentation. And with that said, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenter, Dr. Sylvia Chong. Dr. Chong is Director of the Asian Pacific American Studies Program at the University of Virginia and Associate Professor of English and Associate Director of American Studies. I had reached out to Dr. Chong a couple months ago after coming across her UVA Today article entitled "A Race So Different, Asians and Asian Americans in UVA's History." Dr. Chong was more than receptive to the idea of turning that article into a virtual presentation, but thought it might be worth considering broadening the historical scope and examining Asians and Asian Americans, not just in the context of UVA's history, but the history of its nation, and thus the subject of this evening's discussion, and a very timely one. We are grateful and honored to have Dr. Chong with us this evening and in the month of May, Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. Here to discuss the history of anti-Asian violence in the US, would you please help me welcome Dr. Sylvia Chong.
Thank you so much, Evan, and thank you to those brave of you to spend your Tuesday night listening to this, and to everyone, I guess, out there in YouTube land. I will share my screen. I have a little bit of a presentation that goes with this. We'll start this here. So a couple of words of preface, just to give you context. I did write an article about the history of Asians at UVA, which you can Google and find online. I didn't want to go through that same ground here, but I will sort of say as a segue into this talk or this presentation, that one of my life's work in my research and also in my teaching is to have people understand Asian Americans in relation to one another, into relation to other Americans, both white, Black, Native American, Latinx. And the importance here is for us to think of race in a non-binary way. And to think about the complexity of race, which is not to say that racism doesn't exist, or that racism in some ways isn't painfully obvious even in our present moment. But I think the solutions and the thinking through the issues can be very hard. So with the UVA history, it was to understand how Asians came to UVA in the midst of Reconstruction and an establishment of Jim Crow segregation in the South. Asians definitely came into a context in which they were already trying to be understood. Today's talk is maybe a little bit more general, but I wanted to walk you through a long history of anti-Asian violence starting in the 19th century, because one of the constant refrains in our current moment is, oh, this is so new. People are killing and beating up Asians for the first time. And, you know, as scholars and actually many just regular Asian Americans know through their personal experience and what they follow, that is absolutely not true. There has been anti-Asian violence since the early days of the US Republic. And that violence has always been tied to concerns that also pull in other groups that have experienced racial violence. And so part of this, which some of you who might not agree with this talk might demean as critical race studies, which I think most people don't even quite understand. I guess that's race studies that's critical to the US. And if that's what it is, certainly this is part of that. But like the 1619 Project for the New York Times, we can't understand where we are right now if we don't understand how deeply embedded some of these patterns are in the things that we do and experience. And that playbook of cornering Asian migrants and also Asian Americans and painting him into a xenophobic, sort of hateful corner is a very common playbook at times of national crisis, and also is something that many groups are invited to join in on. So as you know, as my African Americanist colleagues point out, one of the ways that Asian immigrants Americanize is by learning to be racist against Blacks. Well, one of the ways that African Americans reinforce and Latinx people reinforce their Americanness is joining in xenophobic attacks on Asian Americans. So there's ways in which a lot of this violence is relational. And I'm not saying that this is all equivalent or even in the same scope as this history's, as our nation's history of genocide against natives and also enslavement of Africans, people of African descent. It's not equivalent, but at the same time, I think it's part of the same pattern. So what I offer you tonight is a way to think about that pattern from the Asian American side of things. And I wrote this originally in the wake of the Atlanta shooting, so hence the references, which I think is a little remote now, but I think I'm keeping them in because I think it's an important moment. So I come to you today with a heavy heart, one that has been hurting since the pandemic has announced an open season on harassing, injuring, and killing Asians in the US, and one that has been rubbed raw with the murder of 8 people in Atlanta in March. And I should say, since I've written this, also with the mass shooting of a large number of Sikh Americans in Indianapolis. Feng Daoyu, shown here, was one of the last of the Atlanta victims to be buried, because there was no one locally in the US to claim her body. She was laid to rest on Easter weekend by strangers, thousands of miles away from her family in rural Guangdong province, who could not travel to the US to collect her ashes because of money and COVID restrictions. For many Asian Americans, Feng's death is painful to bear because her life is so eerily and intimately familiar to us. She was 44 when she died at Young's Asian Massage, just a year younger than I am now, and had been in the US for over 22 years, longer than many of you have been alive. Well, when I said this was to students. She was toiling in low-wage jobs as a nail tech, a beautician, and in spas to send money back to her mother, who was widowed since Feng was 8 years old. She had only worked at Young's for a few months and spoke little English, and she had remained a Chinese national with an ambiguous immigration status, despite her long sojourn in the US, always intending to return to China after she had made enough money to support her mother in her twilight years. There are many people who want to write off Feng Daoyu's murder as an anomaly, an exception blamed on a lone gunman whose mental illness or personal grievances or bad day had nothing to do with our nation's history or wider patterns of anti-Asian violence. I'm here today to say otherwise. Racial violence has never been simply a personal affair. It always reflects deep-seated anxieties and antagonisms that are promoted at the most elite levels of our white supremacist society, even if the killings are often committed by equally marginalized people, often working class, sometimes even other people of color. And like all racial violence, the Atlanta murders are meant to send a message, one that is heard loud and clear, not only by those who identify with the victims, but also those who sympathize or excuse the killers. This has always been the MO behind lynchings such as that of Emmett Till, and mass killings such as the Sand Creek Massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho people in 1864, or the Tulsa, Oklahoma Massacre of 1921 against African Americans, or the Zoot Suit riots of 1943 that targeted Chicano youth. The message reminds the racially marginalized that we are expendable, that we better not step out of line, tempt their men, rape their women, steal their jobs, invade their neighborhoods, and spread our filth and disease and immorality to their safe spaces, or else we will suffer. These were the very same tactics that were used against the earliest Asian migrants to the US. In the 1871 Los Angeles Massacre, white and Mexican Americans killed 19 Chinese immigrants. And at the massacre at Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885, white miners killed at least 28 and possibly up to 50 Chinese. In both massacres, not a single perpetrator was brought to justice. In Los Angeles, 8 men received manslaughter convictions, but all were overturned. And in Rock Springs, those arrested were released when the white community refused to testify against them. These massacres, along with countless individual acts of violence, were produced by the same hysteria that sparked the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which essentially blamed Chinese workers rather than white industrialists for the economic suffering of white laborers. The Chinese, however, were not the only targets of such violence. At first, Japanese and later Filipino and South Asian migrants were brought in to replace the Chinese coolie labor, and they too faced acts of mass racial violence and harassment. There are too many to describe today, but we might note the Bellingham, Washington state riots of 1907, which drove away over 125 South Asian workers. And then the Watsonville, California riots of 1930, which ran hundreds of Filipino farm workers out of town. And of course, the Japanese American incarceration of 1942 to 45, which imprisoned over 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them US citizens, in about a dozen concentration camps spread across the interior West and West Coast. Fast forward to 1982, when Vincent Chin, a 27-year-old Chinese American, was bludgeoned to death by two white auto workers in Detroit, Michigan. In many ways, Chin's murder was nothing special. Like the Atlanta shootings, the killers did not scream racial epithets during the killings. They did not leave behind racist manifestos or profess membership in a known extremist organization. But like the numerous incidents from 40, 80, 100 years ago, this was again set against a backdrop of economic and social hostility against Asians. This time, the impact of the rise of Japanese automakers on the auto industry in Detroit. And like the cases in Rock Springs, Wyoming, Vincent Chin's killers were barely punished. Although they pleaded guilty to manslaughter, neither received any jail time and only had to pay a $3,000 fine. This sparked national outrage, leading many activists to push for Asian Americans to be included as a protected class under hate crime and civil rights policies. But such criminal justice policies do not even begin to address the sources of antagonism and exclusion that made Vincent Chin a victim in the first place. In fact, it was a liberal white judge, Charles Kaufman, who deemed Chin's life to be worth only $3,000 in the first place. Just as in 2016, when Judge Aaron Persky sentenced rapist Brock Turner, whose victim was also an Asian American, Chanel Miller, to only 6 months in jail to be released after serving only half his sentence. Even more recently, in 2012, a known white supremacist entered a Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, killing 6 people and wounding 4 more. And in 2015, closer to home here, 3 UNC students of Syrian and Palestinian descent were killed in their parking lot by an angry neighbor. These mass shootings were a product of the Islamophobia that has run rampant since 9/11, 2001, and which has also ensnared non-Muslim South Asians and Middle Easterners, and has particularly targeted male Sikh Americans and female Muslims whose religious headgear make them particularly vulnerable to racial profiling. In the year after 9/11, 2001, at least 19 people who were South Asian and Middle Eastern were murdered in private acts of violence that mirror the publicly sanctioned violence of the Patriot Act, which arrested, detained, or deported about 2,000 Arab, Muslim, and South Asians. An act which cited the Japanese American incarceration, in fact, as its legal precedent. I know that Asian Americans do not want to be defined merely as victims of racist hatred. And there are many calls online not only to stop Asian hate, but to celebrate Asian joy, uplift Asian artists, support Asian businesses, protect Asian communities, and recognize Asian accomplishments. But we can't begin to love Asian Americans if we don't understand that the hatred against us is not just from deranged individuals, but come from long-standing and widespread patterns of economic scapegoating, racial triangulation, exploitation, and demonization that also affect Black, Latinx, and Indigenous Americans. And love can be just as racist as hate. So remember that the next time you're doing yoga, sipping boba, listening to BTS, and turning the other cheek when someone cracks an anti-Asian joke, demeans an Asian accent, or pushes an Asian person in a store or subway train. You can stop Asian hate all you want, but the message you are sending with your inaction is loud and clear. And I end here with a photo from the vigil for the victims of the Atlanta shooting that we held at UVA. So I will stop sharing, I guess. Did I stop sharing? What I went through is a really sort of long and cursory kind of history, but I did so in order to, I guess, start having us think of patterns. And one of the patterns that we talk about in Asian American studies is being the targets of discrimination and exclusion and marginalization is actually what binds Asian Americans together. It's not our language, it's not our food, it's not our essential Confucian values, whatever those are. At least in the US, what binds South Asians, Filipinos, Japanese, Chinese, Koreans, even Palestinians and Syrians, is a shared sense of an overlapping marginalization in society. And I think in this way, this starts to overlap with other things that are going on right now, including the Palestinian freedom movement right now, Black Lives Matter, and continuing struggles for indigenous rights, and the struggle to there are multiple struggle to legitimate Latinx Americans as Americans in the face of very anti-immigrant and undocumented people rhetoric. Again, this is not to say these are all the same, and we have a lot of time for discussion, so I'm happy to go into any of the things that I've mentioned in the slideshow. But I thought this was a chance to at least think about how many things have been going on for how long, and what sort of binds them together, and what might be parallels between today and yesterday, today and 100 years ago, today and 150 years ago. So with that, I think I will end my spiel. I'm happy to spiel more, but I'll end my spiel here and see if there are any questions from the audience or things that you would like me to talk about more.
Thank you, Sylvia. If you could type them into the chat box, or if you want to ask your question out loud, just click the raise hand icon and I can unmute you.
I wasn't going to talk at you all for an hour, so please. Although I will talk more if you let me know what it is you would like to hear about more. Oh, something came out in Q&A. Let me see what it is. I won't necessarily name who asked the question unless you would like to be named, and you can let me know that in chat. But I got a question here. Would you agree that there's some hesitancy on the part of some Asian Americans to acknowledge racism because of the desire to be as American as possible? For my father and grandmother's generation, that seems to be the case. I think, again, when we talk about racism, there can be tendencies to personalize things, so that racist hate comes from individuals, and that also then means responses to racism have to be individual. So I think there are probably individual patterns of being willing or not willing to acknowledge anti-Asian racism on the part of Asians. And I should say Asians, for any of the Asians in this audience, but or that are listening here, Asians and Asian Americans are very diverse. You can be a fourth generation American, or you can be someone who only came to the US after college, after your formative years. Or you could be someone who is an adoptee, or someone who is biracial or of mixed immigrations, heritages, meaning from an immigrant mother and a second generation father, something like that. There are a lot of factors that make you willing or less willing to speak out. But I will say that at least for a large number of Asian Americans who feel the pressure of assimilation, and I'll say not everyone does, because if you feel like you are foreign and you are always 1 foot out the door, maybe you never identify with being American enough to feel personally targeted. But those who feel the pressure of assimilation, part of the narrative is it is your fault. If you receive violence, it is because you are sticking out. You were too foreign. You're not enough of one of us. This is not to say that Asian Americans who learn to speak English, listen to whatever American music, learn to watch American TV, are somehow sellouts, or as sometimes people say, bananas, yellow on the outside, white on the inside. But a lot of people do believe that there are ways to actually protect yourself from violence, and that is to be the good immigrant. One of the histories I don't talk about here because it's a little bit complicated, it's not always a violent history, is that the idea of the model minority came out not on its own, but in relation to the civil rights movement and to Black activism in the US. And so those people who were framing model minority discourse in the 50s and 60s, that's where it came out, only did so because they had a problem minority that was starting to visibly agitate for rights in a Cold War climate in which the US was very embarrassed to show developing Asian and African nations that had these racial problems. And so one of the things that they touted was the Japanese Americans who had recently been interned. Some people called it interned, I would say incarcerated, imprisoned against their will on a dubious legal basis for 2 to 3 years during World War II. The consequence of the incarceration, the Japanese American incarceration, not just on Japanese Americans, but on anyone else who was paying attention, Filipinos, Chinese, Sikh Americans, was that if you step out of line, if you get aligned with the enemy too much, there's nothing you can do to rehabilitate yourself. So what you need to do is try to blend in, try to make yourself invisible, assimilate, obviously, but also assimilate in ways that are not about, this is not assimilate like and be a loud American. It was to be a quiet American. That was actually a book that Japanese Americans wrote. So just in answer to the question about like, do Asian Americans internalize this, and what makes them hesitant to talk about racism? I think some of it is personal, like feeling like you can personally ward off racism, but it's societal that we have that belief at all, in the sense that there were actual programs of reintegrating Japanese Americans after World War II, which was to take them and put them back into sort of majority white neighborhoods so that they wouldn't be clustered in the segregated enclaves, or to encourage them to, rather than complaining or protesting, to go to school and to get jobs, even though at the time, jobs were very limited and also mostly within an ethnic economy. So it was government intervention that encouraged this. And even if you weren't the target of this, if you were Chinese American, Korean American, South Asian American, Filipino, you paid attention to this. And then you said to yourself, we have memoirs like this of Filipino Americans who were like, well, we're loyal. We're not like the Japanese. And so they also prided themselves on somehow being on the good side of racism. And this is always a very difficult strategy. I tell people, I don't ever blame anyone for doing what they need to feel safe, but it's a really hard long-term strategy to employ, because the line of safety when you maintain that sort of xenophobic racist logic is very thin. And all it takes is one global event for you to be on the wrong side. So Kim Jong-un will bomb South Korea and Taiwan and maybe try to bomb Washington State. And BTS will not be enough to rehabilitate Korean Americans, for example. Or as we're seeing, it's a complicated situation in South Asia right now. But right now there's a lot of alliance between India and the US against so-called Islamophobia, which has put Pakistan and Muslim-dominant South Asian countries in a bad place. But if tensions flared and Pakistan were to somehow emerge as a combatant, Indian Americans would be affected, and people would not see the difference. So that's one of the difficult things. I see a couple other questions, so let me draw some of these other things in. I have a question about in what ways do Asian Americans experience intersection-based treatment? How do for example, how do Asian women or Asian men have unique experiences, or gay or trans Asian American men and women? So this is a great question and also very complicated. It impacts on the Atlanta shootings because except for, oh, you know, now I'm not forgetting, there were 8 victims, 6 were Asian women. One was a white woman, and then I think one was, oh no, her husband survived. I believe one was a white man who was working at the store, at one of the massage spas. Intersectionality means that experiencing the world as an Asian woman is it becomes hard to detangle what part of the treatment that you receive is because of sexism and what part is because of racism. And I will say that, so I can't untangle that for you, but I think one of the phenomenons we saw was that a lot of activists at first wanted to cast this as gender-based violence. And it was gender-based violence, but it was a kind of gender-based violence that was very classed and racialized, in the sense that, look, I have gone to Oasis Spa in Charlottesville, a high-end white-owned spa is for the most part not going to receive the kind of attack that Young's Asian Massage received. It's also not going to receive the kind of denigration that would lead to law enforcement harassment that a place like Young's Asian Massage received. So I think in that case, there is a gender-based violence that targets women as sources of sexual contagion and sort of preying upon innocent men. That is generally a form of gender discrimination, but women are not all equally vulnerable to that. So I think one of the things that we would talk about with intersection is the ways that the history of US militarism makes people see Asian women as prostitutes. We talk about the Japanese having comfort women, essentially sex slaves, but every US militarized regime in Vietnam, in Thailand, in the Philippines, in South Korea, in Japan, they have all had quasi-state sanctioned prostitution of local women to service the sexual needs of American servicemen of all races. And that kind of racialized neo-colonial violence makes people come back and think, well, if that is what Asian women exist as, when they come into the US, that is what they continue to exist as. So I think, for example, a lot of people misunderstood that. And so what the Me Too movement, for example, in focusing on rape and sexual harassment did is focus on a certain type of sexual harassment that is more prevalent in professional managerial workspaces, creative workspaces. Spaces in which people are more vulnerable to this sort of like intimate attack because you work largely unsupervised. But here we have a kind of employment-based gendered vulnerability where women are providing a bodily service, you know, so massage, but, you know, we could also include, you know, beauticians, nail techs and things like that. And they are denigrated for having these jobs and are vulnerable in having these, their places of employment stigmatized as sites of prostitution, whether or not they are. So, and this is not at all to demonize prostitution, but just to say that there's a de facto assumption that these places are illegal and illicit, and so they don't receive the same kind of police protection in the first place. So I will, you know, just note that Asian spas were not only involved in the Atlanta shootings, but also in the sex crime accusations against Patriots manager Robert Kraft. I think those charges were dismissed because of some issue with how the evidence was collected. But again, that was Asian women suspected of providing sexual services and sort of demeaned as criminals rather than as victims of sexual violence. So I hope that answers that question about, or at least touches upon that question about intersectionality. And I can go, if that wasn't enough, I can talk about it some more. Yes, I have talked about the fact that discrimination against Asian Americans can come from people of color. I have heard a lot of this from, I wouldn't say they're friends, but people online that I associate with. I think it's a mistake to think that that means everyone can be racist or everyone is equally racist. Anti-Asian violence comes out of white supremacy. And the reason that other groups of color indulge in it is that it can become a way of seizing or identifying with power. But anti-Asian violence comes from the same white supremacy that anti-Black violence comes from. So Asian Americans participate in anti-Black violence and marginalization and harassment for the same reasons, because it becomes a way of identifying with power. So like, I don't know what to say about this idea that like, because one Black person has yelled at you to go back to China, that means somehow the source of anti-Asian violence is African Americans. I would say that that idea of going back to China, as I told you, came out of the 1870s, 1860s. Lots of people yelled at Asians, go back to X, where, you know, it wasn't always China. Go back to China, go back to India, go back to the Philippines. And what that meant was that somehow when laborers were put into competition with one another, you lose your job because there's another laborer working. And somehow people forget that, like, who is paying labor? How did those Asian workers get here? Who is profiting from the uneven labor market that makes some labor cheap and the other labor not? So I don't know if that tells you what to do in a situation where someone yells at you. I mean, I would say that, you know, I'm not saying, you know, open your arms and you know, and embrace the, you know, the racial violence that's being directed at you. But I think you have to think that people of color would not say that to each other if they were not being pitted against each other. So that right now, I think a lot of the racial violence that P have talked about come from not only people of color, African Americans and Latinos, but people who are really socially vulnerable. They are unhoused, often have untreated mental illness, living below the poverty line. I'm surprised that, well, I'm not surprised that billionaires are not being accosted. Warren Buffett is not being accosted, and, you know, Donald Trump is not being accosted as the source of that economic degradation. But people who are elite, often white and capitalists, are shielded from that violence, and people of color who are vulnerable are left to yell at each other in subway stations. So I think I don't like hearing crap like that either, but I also think, you know, the way to respond is not to say, respond with an equal amount of violence, because it's giving into this idea that we should concentrate on fighting each other and not think about, well, what put us in this position? What is the long view of this game? What is the long range picture of how we got here? Q&A. What would I recommend as books or documentaries that offer the most accurate perspectives? It's hard. I mean, I'm happy to sort of show some things that people should read. I think one of the hard things is that sometimes knowledge is not automatically equal sympathy or understanding. But I do think, you know, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt. One of the best books I recommend to non-academics. One of the audience members is my former student, so she'll remember that I taught Strangers from a Different Shore by Ronald Takaki. But I do think that can be a little bit too detailed for the average reader, especially one who isn't familiar with these events. So a good primer book, a starter book that I recommend is Helen Zia's Asian American Dreams. Because she focuses on a lot of more contemporary events, contemporary to when she wrote the book. I believe it was published in the 90s. Helen Zia was one of the activists who worked with Vincent Chin's family to get justice for Vincent Chin's murder. And she, before that, she was a labor organizer in Detroit, which is sort of how she found herself, you know, on the ground there. So Asian American Dreams by Helen Zia, ZIA, is a great place to start. I think sometimes people forget how South Asians are very much part of Asian America, and that there's been a lot of analogous treatment of South Asians as East Asians. And so another great book, again, maybe a little bit more on the academic side, but I think he writes beautifully, is Vijay Prasad's The Karma of Brown Folk. It's meant to be a play on W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. And he actually talks about the model minority myth origins pretty plainly. That's a great book. In terms of things to watch, if you have kids and you sort of want a sort of more even-keeled history, there's a PBS series that's made by one of our most longest working documentarians, Asian American documentarians, Renee Tajima Pena. She was the executive producer of a 5-part PBS series simply called Asian Americans. I believe because of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, or a PDOM, as we call it at UVA, Asian Pacific Islander Desi American Heritage Month. I think it's streaming for free, but I think you can watch it with a PBS subscription at other times. Asian American, and it covers the history, but with a lot of interviews of people who are involved. And I think it's a life-changing film, but the film Who Killed Vincent Chin, also by Renee Tajima Pena. It was made in 1985. The Vincent Chin murder was 1982. I think is life-changing for a lot of people because it really delves into the situation. Detroit was not a majority Asian American town. It was very black and white. But this film really shows you a little bit of the long-standing Asian presence, even in the Midwest, but also the invisibility of that population, and then how that leads to this prosecution or the lack of prosecution. And the majority of that documentary is interviews with Vincent Chin's killer, who for some reason was really happy to bare his soul and talk to 2 Asian American women on camera about all the things he was thinking and not thinking. And I think he thought he was exonerating himself, but it's really just telling in all the ways. He killed Vincent Chin in a drunken bar fight that went so far that he actually went and got a baseball bat, came back and beat Vincent Chin to death after they got into a scuffle. So it was very much intentional and not an accident and not just a crime of passion. But the way you can hear about it is a small history of anti-Asian violence. He didn't understand his anger towards Vincent. He didn't understand Vincent's existence in his community. Vincent Chin was also worked for the auto industry, but as sort of an engineer. All they could see is Japanese cars and the downfall of the auto industry in the US. And even if he couldn't name it, Vincent became sort of a symbol of all those things. If not in his mind as he was beating him with a baseball bat, certainly in the mind of everyone who excused the murder afterwards. Oh, and Evan mentions here that if you are a JMRL the library card holder, you can stream it. Vincent Chin, Who Killed Vincent Chin is available in a lot of library systems. Don't get it confused with Vincent Who, because this is a very important event for Asian American activism, but it gets forgotten. So lots of people, even young Asian American activists, don't know the history of this. And so Curtis Choi made a newer documentary in the 2000s, early 2000s, called Vincent Who, which got older activists to talk about how Vincent Chin's case got them into activism, but also then younger students and activists talking about how this was entirely erased from their historical sort of understanding of America. And I think this is, again, Vincent Chin is not special in the sense that, and sadly, there are many victims of anti-Asian violence. But I think Vincent Chin's case was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back in a particular situation where people were just unwilling to put up with another non-prosecution and and demonization of a victim. And so he became important to a generation. And then maybe he's not important now. I don't know whether the Atlanta killings might become this for another generation of students, but and people. But just like with George Floyd's murder, he is not the only victim of police violence, and yet I think he catalyzed things, and the fact that his killer was able to be brought to trial, which is a rare and unusual occurrence, made people willing to look at that case in a way that they were not perhaps willing to look at Breonna Taylor's case, for example. So Vincent Chin, I think, is very interesting, and it's recent enough, 40 years, that I think of it as recent history, and a little bit more present than Chinese exclusion, which can seem like a footnote to people. Other thoughts, questions? I feel like the teacher of a Zoom class where everyone's on YouTube instead of listening to me.
By the way, the Asian Americans documentary, the PBS documentary, is available. The DVD is available to request. Unfortunately, it's not on Canopy, but it can be requested from JMRL. So.
I checked, and after the Atlanta shootings, they made it stream for free, and then now because of Asia Pacific American Heritage Month, I think it's also streaming for the rest of the month. Sadly, I think it's going to go behind a paywall. But even if you looked at clips of it, I think it's sort of interesting.
Right.
Could I explain more about what is the model minority myth and what effect does it have on Asians? I can. I hate talking about it, I will have to admit, because I think for a lot of Asian Americans, it's the only stereotype they want to talk about. But I actually think there are much worse stereotypes that are more harmful. But the model minority myth, I think one sees it, discussed frequently, so it's worth sort of saying. It's the idea that when it was first at least articulated, you can be a minority and not complain about your discrimination, and you turn out all right. So the example, the paradigm of this was Japanese Americans in the 60s. And so it was this paradox or conundrum for social scientists. Obviously, Japanese Americans had been discriminated against. They were removed from their homes. They experienced a lot of racial animus and segregation and laws banning their ability to make a living in the West Coast up to the 1940s. So there were things where you couldn't own a farm if you're Japanese American, and then you couldn't work a farm that someone else owned if you're Japanese American. You weren't allowed into certain cities. It was illegal for you to sponsor relatives to immigrate. It was illegal for you to apply for citizenship and thus have voting rights. So how can Japanese Americans who receive quite a lot of discrimination, I don't want to say more than other groups, but quite a lot, why is it that when we look at them in the 60s, they seem to have pretty good socioeconomic status indicators, according to what sociologists collected? They were not on the whole impoverished. They were not on the whole lacking educational attainment. They were not on the whole with higher rates of arrests and criminal convictions. So they're perfect. We discriminate against them, and it's like that doll that you punch and gets up again. They get up again. What is so wonderful about this group? This is the social scientific question. I'm being sarcastic. This is not actually what I think. And the answer they came up with is, it's because they're so weird. It's because they have this alien culture. That's actually one of the terms that sociologist William Peterson used. We've been thinking that the solution to racism is assimilating people, but it must be because the Japanese have this alien Japanese culture, and they don't even know what it was, but they just called it an alien culture. That word is not accidentally used, because Japanese Americans were put in prisons because they were enemy aliens during World War II. And why are they aliens? Because they weren't citizens. Why weren't they citizens? Because it was illegal to naturalize them as citizens. So they could be in this country for 80 years and still not be citizens. Anyways, so there's a train, why you call them aliens. So what that has come to stand for in the 80s, as model minority has spread to include the Chinese, Koreans, South Asians, even Filipinos and Vietnamese later on, is that if you're a model minority, somehow there's something, some inherent cultural value in you that makes you study hard, work hard, do good in math, and not complain. That is all construction. It's all bullshit. There are plenty of Asians who are bad at math, plenty of Asians who are below the poverty line. In fact, Asian Americans as a group have the widest distribution of economic statuses, so that there's more people both above and on the top and the bottom of the economic distribution in Asian America. Asian Americans did not have high levels of incarceration because, and this is what a lot of historians have been doing, Asian Americans distrusted the police and also tried to police their own communities, so that crimes, petty crimes, for the most part, they would try to divert from the criminal justice system. But they definitely had articles and bemoaning juvenile delinquency among Japanese and Chinese teens in the 60s. They just did it in their private Japanese and Chinese language newspapers. Did they have higher levels of educational attainment? Possibly, because I think people were desperate to try to find ways into the economy and into sort of the middle class. But in the 50s and 60s, you could easily find college graduates of Asian descent basically working the same jobs that their parents worked as grocery store clerks and farmers and store owners. So I think the idea of the model minority myth is that somehow success can come despite discrimination. And there's a way for social scientists to say, we shouldn't care as much about discrimination because it's not holding people back. So let's stop caring about systematic discrimination against African Americans. But obviously the construction of the model minority is that there's a model minority and there's a problem minority. And the problem minority is the one that was supposed to be silenced by the presence of the model minority. The strange turnaround is that the people who were model minorities, who didn't come up with that term, suddenly alternatively embraced it and sort of obsessed about it. So I think there are people who are like, yes, we are the model minority. So Andrew Yang, yes, we are good at math and we are billionaires. There are people who embrace that and as some kind of strange form of pride, I don't know, simulation. And then there are people who are like, I'm not a model minority. And I think sometimes that can be sort of like saying, I don't just want to do math. I want to write poetry. I want to be an activist. I am not silent, and I don't necessarily mind people pushing back against that, except you just have to remember that we cannot be model minorities without being in a system where we're being used against someone. So I think the effect that it has on Asians is that it prevents solidarity activism. So in the ways in which, Latinx and African-American activists have, in some cases, not all, pushed to have common cause in contesting housing segregation, employment discrimination, mass incarceration, Asian Americans have not. Because they're like, oh, we don't have those problems, despite the fact that actually Asian Americans are, especially in certain socioeconomic classes, are incarcerated at very high rates, and that Asian Americans constitute one of the largest groups of undocumented immigrants and also deportees. So there's ways in which people because we're the model minority, we don't have problems, makes it hard for anyone who's reporting on problems to raise awareness of problems, because the biggest problem is I'm not a math nerd, as opposed to the problem is I'm an exploited worker of racial capitalism. So I think the model minority myth, and actually a colleague of mine wrote a really great analysis of this with Harvard University, because Harvard University, home of a lot of model minorities, recently told Asian Americans after the Atlanta shootings, if you are feeling sad or traumatized after shootings, don't worry. It's common to be ashamed to be Asian. And the way to deal with that is to meditate and do some self-care, which made a lot of Asian activists say, what the hell? Only a model minority, because these were actually Asian American counselors, would say to another Asian, it's okay to be ashamed to be Asian. We all feel that way sometimes. Just take a deep breath and everything will be okay. As opposed to, I'm not ashamed to be Asian. I'm very angry at the way America treats Asians. I think that's sort of the a response that a model minority myth can't quite encompass, because it's about success at the price of acquiescence to a system, and acquiescence at the cost of solidarity movements and other forms of allyship. So I think that's the most deleterious aspect of the model minority myth. Not that it's preventing anyone from being a punk rocker, but that it is actually standing in the way of people seeing patterns in their discrimination, patterns in their marginalization, and seeing who else stands with them. I haven't read Minor Feelings. I'm sorry, it's on my summer reading list. In fact, it's on my JMRL hold list, and I've got like 16 more weeks before I will get that book. It's apparently very popular, and I'm trying to read it for free through the library. I forget the author. Minor Feelings is a set of essays that very personal essays. From what I've read of the book, very similar in some ways to Claudia Rankine's Citizen, in that it's sort of a quasi-memoir, but very, Cathy Park Hong, thank you. Quasi-memoir-like, but also sort of a very artfully put together set of reflections on what it feels to be Asian in America. A very intense read. Well, a lot of reads are. I have on my book list, which I did get off my holds, on This Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. I study a lot of Vietnamese American literature and culture. So I was really curious to get my hands on that first. And it's a story of being a queer refugee and sort of the complications there of attachment to family, but also questions of assimilation and also refugees-ness, which is different from immigration because it kind of puts you in a country under very forced circumstances that are not always under your control. So I've just started it, so I would highly recommend that. But yes, the Cathy Park Hong book is also on my reading list. As is Crying in H Mart, which I was thinking of recommending as a summer read to people. Another PBS station wanted my contribution to summer reading list. So repeat the name of the other book. Okay, let me Google it to make sure I do not get it wrong. Because it has one of those complicated titles. On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Let me type that in to everyone. On Earth We Ocean Vuong, who's a poet, and this is his first novel. Crying in H Mart is by Michelle Zauner, I believe, a biracial frontman of an indie band called Japanese Breakfast, but she wrote a really touching essay called Crying in H Mart, which I think the book expands on, about her Korean mother and who recently passed. So it's, yeah, I've heard it's very intense. Any other things you guys are reading that you recommend to all others? Is Japanese Breakfast back? I guess so. I'll have to take a look at that as if I will be going to any concerts with my children in tow, but that good to know. We in our house are highly obsessed with BTS right now. So we are waiting for them to tour so that I can drag my young army to go see them.
These are just some links to the catalog for the books you've been mentioning, Sylvia.
Okay, great. I also have on my JMRL hold list Charles Yu's Interior Chinatown. Charles Yu has mostly written speculative fiction, but I think this is a more realist novel, Interior Chinatown, about people, actors and people playing things, sort of roles on the edges of Hollywood. That's what I understand it's about. Of course, I haven't read it, so I don't know. And then I don't know if the, this is one of the books I was recommending earlier, and also these are two of my favorite books to recommend to people. If those of you more academically inclined, Wu, this is one of the major recent historians who's written a history of the model minority myth, I guess you could say. Losing people left and right. Well, it looks like we're close to time to wrap up.
Do we have any final questions or say comment? Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sticking with this. I know in some ways this is like a passé topic now, anti-Asian violence. You know, been there, done that, moved on to new shootings. but I think I don't know, I think we'll see more. So thank you all for sticking with this and thinking about it with me.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you so much for taking the time to share this with us.
Thank you,
everybody thank you everybody who came out this evening. Again, this will be recorded and probably be up on YouTube in a couple of days if you want to share with anyone. So yeah, on behalf of JMRL, thank you, Sylvia, and thank you everyone who attended, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Okay. Good night, everyone.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.